The doors of St. Michael's College have been open to the boys of Toronto for 166 years. Founded on the secret of schools run in the French mountains by priests fleeing persecution, St. Mike's quickly became one of Canada's most prestigious institutions. It's a renowned brand, producing sports stars like Hockey Hall of Famers Eric Lindros, Red Kelly, and Frank Mahovlich. And now, St. Mike's is becoming a household name for a completely different reason. There are 6 alleged incidents of assault of students by students. Police allege a group gang raped another student in the school's locker room. Police say the boy was allegedly held down by his classmates and assaulted with a broom handle. The only reason we know about the alleged attack is because it was recorded on a cell phone. 6 boys have been charged. But it took school administrators almost 2 days to call the police after first seeing the video.
I have had this discussion with the victim's parents. I'm willing to take that hit because they're telling me he's healing faster because of the way we managed it. So I'm okay with that.
That was Greg Reeves, the school's former principal. He resigned on Thursday along with the president of St. Mike's. Meanwhile, some former students have come forward with other stories of abuse.
What happened to you? Was it a sexually violent incident?
It was a sexual violent act, yes.
Can you share anything more with me?
You know what, it's already traumatizing enough talking about it. Usually it's 4 or 5 kids. Some of older players, people who are bullies, people who have a little bit of, privilege and sway on the team and in the school, and they corner a new person, a kid who's vulnerable, a kid who's just trying to fit in, a kid who's desperate to stay on that team. And they take advantage of them. And that's what happened to me.
But at least one former student says the reports of bad experiences have been conflated. Like Bill Retzi, who wrote to the National Post saying, if this is true, I must be an unwitting participant in one of the largest informal conspiracies of silence ever conceived. And some parents are coming to the school's defense too.
Our kids are getting bullied
because
by other kids, and the way you're reporting 12-year-olds, 11-year-olds are getting threatened by other kids.
Disgusting.
Yeah, and
these are sexual assault allegations. Aren't you concerned about that?
I'm more concerned about what the media is doing to the school around this incident. You're not helping.
Cases like these can happen at any high school, but there's something different about elite private high schools. In Ontario, they don't have to follow the same rules. While Ontario public schools have to follow strict protocols designed to protect students, private schools have next to no government oversight. They're actually recognized as businesses, free to make up their own rules as they see fit. This 115-page document is the Private School Policy and Procedure Manual supplied by the Ministry of Education. Unlike the rules public schools follow, in this one, the words assault, bullying, violence, police, or sex don't appear at all. In its 2013 annual report, the Ontario's Auditor General concluded that the province has one of the least regulated private school sectors in Canada, and even warns that the public should also know that the Ministry of Education has only limited involvement with private schools. Joining me is John Schumann. He's an education lawyer who advises students and parents in cases against private schools. So, John, you actually graduated from St. Mike's a few years ago. When you heard the news, the allegations this past week, were you surprised?
Well, I think a lot of the alumni, I wasn't surprised that this had gone on. This would have been within the norm of the school while I was there.
So you had heard incidents like these allegations before from St. Mike's?
I'd heard things very similar, yes. They were sexual and they were involving, objects and things like that, and being non-consensual. And it was part of a hazing ritual, and it's something that I think every sports team person felt they went through, and it was normalized.
If the allegation of student-on-student sexual abuse is true, what is, in broad strokes, the difference between what is required to be reported at a public school versus what is required to be reported at a private school?
All the publicly funded schools have got specific guidelines when they must call the police.
And private schools don't?
And private schools do not.
What do they have?
They don't have their own policies or their own contract with the parents about when they're going to call the police.
So there's no obligation, and then there's no oversight by the province?
There's no oversight by the province over private schools. The principle in this case would be the same as whether you wanted to report a crime or not. It's exactly the same situation, and you may choose not to because you don't want to get into that mess.
So when you heard that there had been as long as a 2-day delay in going to police, that didn't surprise you?
Well, it didn't surprise me that a private school could or would do that.
So how do you explain it? What do you think went on behind closed doors?
Well, I can only go by what the principal said. The principal said the student said he wasn't comfortable revealing it to anybody or having him call the police. Although, to me, that sounded not really like the right strategy, because if you asked a public school teacher about this, who would just automatically report it because they've got a protocol, they don't even think about it, it's sexual abuse, we call police. They would say to you, once we get the police involved, particularly in Toronto, they have a center, a child advocacy center, and they come in and they can provide the victim with a lot of resources and help.
Instead of the teacher or the principal in this case. I'm wondering, like St. Mike says that it does have detailed policies on bullying, harassment, and child protection, that it does pay attention to these things, but you have a problem with that because, what, it's because it's self-policing?
Well, it is entirely self-policing, and apparently their policy in this case didn't require them to report.
But why doesn't the ministry have a responsibility to step in?
Well, there's nothing in the Education Act that gives them the power to step in. It's not what the Education Act does. It gives very limited oversight over private schools that is related to things like keeping attendance and making sure kids get tested appropriately before they get their high school diploma.
Do you see now calls for change because of this?
I would hope so. I think that there's been a long time, there's been some issues about private schools, and parents, when they come to see me with a private school issue, they very frequently say, well, the Education Act says, and I thought my child had right under the Education Act. And I say, well, no, you're in a private school. The Education Act almost entirely doesn't apply, including with some big issues like, discipline and special needs and bullying. Those don't apply.
This makes you mad.
It get me upset, because some of the things I've seen with kids who get badly treated, and they don't have any real legal recourse in a lot of situations. There could be a contract with the school that says we don't have to deal with these situations. We don't have to deal with bullying situations. And if the parents agreed to that when they signed on, even though they didn't look at the fine print, they just agreed to pay their money, there's nothing they can do about it. All they can do is change schools.
So much to watch for there. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
We reached out to St. Michael's College for a reaction to our story, and they didn't get back to us. But the Ontario government sent us this statement about private school oversight, saying the Ministry of Education is undergoing a widespread review of our education system, which includes taking a look at our current relationship with private schools. So what happens in other provinces? Well, it depends. For example, Quebec forces private and public schools to follow the same rules. British Columbia tells us certificate holders, presumably teachers, are obliged to report abuse by other teachers, but they didn't tell us how that could apply to student-on-student abuse. All of this has become more of an issue as private school enrollment keeps growing across the country. Now, about 7% of elementary and secondary students attend private schools in Canada. That's about 400,000 Canadians. You know where it's also 7%? In England, the country that invented private schools. It's also home to the most exclusive and elite institution in the world, Eton College. 19 British prime ministers dating all the way back to the 1700s attended Eton, and it's fit for royalty. Princes Harry and William were educated there too. And take a look at this clip. It's from a BBC documentary about life at Eton done back in the 60s, and the presenter pretty clearly thinks that bullying is just part of private school life.
They live in Chamber, all that's left of an enormous room where for centuries all 70 collegers lived and were locked up for the night to their own devices. These included bullying as a fine art.
Bullying is fine art. Well, there is also in the UK a lack of government oversight, and the private schools there, they too are run like private businesses. But the UK is now in the midst of an independent inquiry into child abuse, and there are calls to make reporting of abuse in private schools mandatory. Joining me from London is Robert Verkaik. He's the author of a book called Posh Boys, which looks at the culture inside private schools in Britain. So, Robert, St. Mike's is famous for its athletic program. It's created a lot of stars who've gone on to become big hockey stars. They went on to have big careers in politics as well. I'm sure you've seen that in the UK, elite schools, elite professions afterwards. Is there something in this culture that contributes to a sense of secrecy?
Things that happen inside these schools are always going to be secret. And what I've found in my investigations over the last couple of years is that the schools only do things when they have to. So, and I think maybe this applies to a school like St Michael's. It's only when something like this gets to the public attention, or in the worst case scenario, you know, the police are involved, will they start to actually investigate and start to, you know, admit perhaps they've got a bit of a problem. Whereas in many cases, certainly in Britain, these problems have been, or complaints have been made, for, you know, for many pupils will have made complaints. These will have been swept under the carpet, nothing will have been done until, you know, it becomes such a problem that they can't manage it anymore. And then it becomes, they're more interested in the reputational management of the school rather than protecting the welfare of the children. And then that's when it becomes you know, a problem, a real problem.
Well, and for the families, private school is a large investment. There's a lot of money involved here.
If you're paying, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars to educate your children, then I think at the very least you expect them to be taught in a safe environment, and you very much expect the child's welfare to be a priority. So but the problem is there's a sort of tension between the school and the parents, because the parents don't want bad publicity, because they're obviously sending their kids to the school, and, you know, it looks bad for the kids. It also looks bad for the school themselves. They want to, if they want more kids, parents to pay top dollar for a private education, then you can't afford to have these kind of stories making mainstream media. So there's an incentive to cover it up. There's a pact, I think, between the parents and the school to hush these things up, because no one wants to damage the reputation of the school and damage a family's reputation as well.
Thanks so much for joining us, Robert. Robert Verkaik in London.